there's a myth that it's the Mount of Ares because Ares had a trial there. He had a trial because he killed Halirrhothios. Halirrhothios, who'd attempted to rape his daughter. So Ares killed him, and there was a trial up there, and it later became an important site for a council, and a council which had a kind of political role at some points and also a legal role. It was a court. So we'll go up there, and it was quite important in the 7th century BC, apparently. It's really hard to know what's going on in this early period, but 594/3, an important date in Athenian history because it's Solon's reforms, and they're important in so many ways, and here again they're important. It seems like this council, the Areopagus, would have had a probalutic function at some point. It helped to advise, it helped to set up and prepare business for the assembly, and after Solon in 594/3, that is a function that goes to the newly instituted Council 400 that Solon draws up. So Areopagus loses that. Still able to do a lot of things, apparently. It had lots of powers associated with it. It's a kind of scrutineer for the laws. It can impose fines on people. It has this power of eisangalia that's associated with it, where you can just sort of denounce people and they'll be instantly tried before the Areopagus. And once we get into the classical period and the democracies installed under Cleisthenes, it continues to be an influential body. It's maybe not as influential as before. I mean, Cleisthenes has a new council of 500. He has the assembly is increasingly powerful. There are lots of new magistracies drawn up. But the archons, the traditional 9 archons who were powerful in the archaic period, they're still prestigious. And it's the archons from whom the Areopagus is drawn. Initially the archons are elected, then after about 487 they're selected by lot from the top 2 property classes, so the Solonian property classes. So basically the top 2 sort of categories of people in Athens, or male citizens in Athens by wealth, they can be allotted onto the Areopagus. And so in terms of the people who would have been on the Areopagus, they would have been slightly wealthier than the average Athenian, and they would have already served as archons, and they served, once they got into the Areopagus, they served for life, which is unique in Athens, actually. You can be a general several times, but you have to renew it every year, and with the allotted offices, it's usually 1 year. So what's that guy doing? So the idea that you're doing this for life is quite unique, and all these features give the Areopagus a kind of conservative cast. It seems to have that kind of coloring in Athens in the classical period. And this is linked to something that I've actually done a separate video on this, working through the Greek of Aeschylus' Eumenides, where you actually have a magnificent speech by Athena when she's founding the Areopagus, because Aeschylus' Eumenides is all about the founding of the Areopagus Council, but as a court, as a murder court. And this is all bound up with the reforms of Ephialtes, 461, 462, 461, 460. Ephialtes reforms come in, and Ephialtes is a radical Democrat. He reforms the system in various ways, but what's relevant to the Areopagus is that he strips it of a lot of its powers. And he claims that he's not really doing anything new, he's just taking it back to what it was like before, because that's the way you often argue for things in Athenian politics. You don't get anywhere by saying, I'm just going to do something new. It's much more persuasive in Athenian culture to say, oh, I'm going back to the ancestral constitution. So Ephialtes claims he's stripping away some of the illegitimate functions that have accrued to the Areopagus over time, and what he leaves it with, he basically leaves it as a court. That's pretty much all it is, and it's a court for a very tightly bound set of functions, a set of cases. Some of them to do with types of sacrilege, so cutting up sacred olive trees and things like that, which by Aristotle, by his time, he says, they're not really, these cases don't really come to court anymore, but they're still on the books. But the most important category of cases that the Areopagus still tries are murder, homicide, and a particular type of homicide, that's deliberate, and it's against male citizens. So they're actually separate courts, the Palladium and the Delphinium, other parts of Athens, for undeliberate homicide or manslaughter, and homicide that leaves killings that lead to the death of women, of slaves or resident foreigners, so not citizens. So yeah, this is what it does. This is what the Areopagus does in the classical period, and it's a well-respected body, and it's particularly, the procedure in the Areopagus is quite formal, and they swear a mighty oath before each trial on the severed parts of a ram and a bull, I think. So they've obviously reconstructed this with that in mind. And we hear from the sources that they meet in the open air. Demosthenes, I think, tells us that they also occasionally met in the Royal Stoa, which is actually the first building I looked at in this whole series, way over there in the Agora, which they actually they don't have in this game, but usually they would have met here. They've reconstructed this with sort of stone seating and in rows. It's very hard. I mean, I don't think this. I've tried to look up the archaeology of what was really there. I suspect back in the day that would have just been wooden seating. If you go to the Areopagus today, it's it's very smooth rock, smooth stone. So they've made it very lush here, which I don't know. Maybe it was like that. And nowadays you can go and there'll be a bunch of students drinking beer and smoking cigarettes and looking over the glittering view of Athens that the Areopagus affords. But yeah, so in the day it would have been a murder court, and in the classical period, as I say, it's very respected. In the 350s, Isocrates writes a speech, Areopagiticus, in which Isocrates, by the way, not Socrates, not an iPhone app that asks you annoying moral questions. He's an orator in his own right. He would say a philosopher. He's an educator, and he says he likes democratia. He likes democracy, but he also thinks it should be kind of led. It should have strong leadership. So people like Pericles in the 5th century should lead it, and also bodies like the Areopagus should be more influential. So he's basically making an argument that the Areopagus should be more influential. It's quite a conservative argument, really. I mean, the people who are more on the conservative side of Athenian politics, even if they're ostensibly Democrats, like Isocrates, they kind of like the Areopagus. And by the time that the Macedonians are becoming increasingly powerful in the Greek world, so 340s and 330s, the Areopagus starts to be more active, and you can read Lycurgus' speech against Theocrates, where he talks about the Areopagus, and it seems that the Areopagus is active in punishing Athenians who did not fight against the Macedonians at the Battle of Carnea and who tried to sort of leave the city afterwards. And yeah, there are various other ways in which it seems to be more influential in this period. So after the Battle of Carnea, the Athenians lose. You know, the Theban and Athenian alliance loses against the Macedonians, and you might think, okay, well then the Athenian Democrats like Demosthenes, who've been against the Macedonians, are that side of the argument is going to collapse. But in fact, it seems like there's a lot of defiance among Democrats in Athens, and there's this fascinating stele that goes up, the Law of Eucrates, put up in I think 337, 336, and it's kind of famous. It has, I'll put the link below. I'm not going to put the picture here because it'll make, I'll have to use the video editor and put the watermark on. But yeah, the decree of Eucrates has a relief of Democratia, the personified goddess of democracy, putting a crown on the head of Demos, the personified people of Athens. And the text of the decree says, basically, you must not set up a tyranny, which is a kind of funny law, because you think, well, if someone sets up a tyrannical regime, they're not going to obey the law. They're just going to smash it, and the Democrats can't do anything. But if you read, there's a book by David Teagarden, Death to Tyrants, which is all about anti-tyranny legislation in the Greek world. And we should really see this in the context of what a lot of Greek city-states were doing, which they were assuming that because there's so much stasis, civil strife in Greek city-states, there's a lot of back and forth in terms of regime types. So they're assuming that at some point a democratic regime is going to take power again. And so the question is, what can they do to incentivize pro-democratic activity and sort of disincentivize anti-democratic activity? So one of the things they do is there's a cult of tyrannicides. And if you went into the ancient Agora, which we've already done a tour of that, but they don't actually have this in the game, but there would have been these statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, the Athenian tyrannicides, tyrant killers. The Athenians said that they'd killed Hippias. Thucydides tells us actually they only killed Hipparchus, the brother of Hippias, who wasn't even in power. But anyway, the Athenians monumentalized them. They lionized them as tyrannicides, and the descendants of the tyrannicides had a place of honor in Athens. They had free meals in the Prytaneon, along with Olympic victors. That's what Socrates wants after his trial, because he said he's such a good philosopher. Instead, they give him hemlock. Yeah, so the decree of Eucrates should be seen in this context as an attempt to say something about what will happen to you if the democracy gets restored. And so the relevant thing about the decree of Eucrates is that it says, if there's a tyrannical regime that's installed, you must not go up to the Areopagus. Areopagites should not meet in the Areopagus Council. And so there are two theories about why it says that. I mean, one is that the Areopagus was seen as a more conservative body in Athens. So then the fear is, well, if there's a tyrannical regime, if there's an anti-democratic regime, the Areopagites will join in. We want to make sure the Areopagites don't do that. It's clear that, they'll be in trouble if they ever do that and democracy gets restored. The other theory, which I think is the one Teagarden goes for, is that it's not that the Areopagus is especially conservative or reactionary, it's just that it's a respected body within Athens. And even though it has more of a conservative history, by the time of the decree of Eucrates, it's a well-respected body within the democratic setup. So then the fear would be, well, if the Areopagites meet under a tyrannical regime, they'll sort of give it more legitimacy. And that's what the Athenians want to stop. Alright, so, there's one more thing, or maybe a couple more things. So one is that the Areopagus also is important in Christian history. Paul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle, comes here and he writes about it in the Acts of the Apostles, and he makes a speech about how the pagans should stop doing pagan things and stop worrying about gold and silver and idols, and they should hear about Jesus, and tells them about the resurrection, and apparently they scoff and they say, we will hear about this some more some other time. So it doesn't go so well. However, a few people convert. One of them is one of the Areopagites, one of the members of the Council of the Areopagus, Dionysius. He becomes known as Dionysius the Areopagite, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. The name of the road in modern Athens that goes around the Acropolis is named after him. He also has two churches named after him in Athens. Pretty large Orthodox one on Skoufas Street in Kolonaki, and also the Catholic one, Metropolitan Catholic one on Panepistimiou. The final bit of kind of Nachleben, afterlife of the Areopagus, is, I mentioned this Isocrates speech already, Areopagiticus. There's also one by John Milton, published in 1644. John Milton, of course, the 17th century poet, author of Paradise Lost, also a kind of political radical. And this was an argument for the freedom of the press. In particular, he was against licensing, the idea that your writings had to be licensed by a higher power. And one of the arguments he makes in that speech is, well, the Athenians didn't do it. Particularly the Areopagus didn't have a licensing system. So it's an interesting example of how Athens has such prestige, even in later Western history, even in the 17th century, in 17th century England, that Milton thinks this is going to be a powerful argument. And Areopagitica is the name of his speech, and like Isocrates, actually, it's not a speech; it was a pamphlet, circulated as a pamphlet. And there's also an online magazine, Areo, which you may have seen, a sort of liberal magazine, and that was named Areo by Malhar Mali when he founded it, because he wanted to evoke the arguments in favor of free speech by John Milton. Obviously, much needed nowadays. I mean, maybe not Milton's particular arguments, but defense of free speech. Okay, so that's the end of this little series. If anyone's watching and you like this, then please feel free to support it, and maybe it'll even allow me to get a better microphone and invest in a video editing program in the paid version. I'm very happy to take requests if you want to go anywhere in this game and you want to learn about a particular part of Greece. Then, yep, we can do that. But for now, that's it. Cheers.